Hi everyone, I'm Annie Cho, and today we're going to look into Unit 1 of AP World History. So first, as many of you guys probably know, Unit 1 is the global tapestry from 1200 C to 1450 C, and it largely just includes one of the most basic and beginning parts starting from the AP World History course. And these are the sections. Today we're going to go through 1.1 to 1.2, so developments in East Asia and Dar al-Islam. But in terms of the AP exam, Unit 1 does not come up very much, if not at all. Like last year, there was no Unit 1 at all. So it's less of a focus, but still good to know the basics since it would help when you write things like your DBQ, LEQ, or SCQ. So let's get into it. So first, 1.1 is on developments in East Asia. So first, the most important empires you have to know in this section is first the Song Dynasty. So you guys probably know that China had many dynasties like the Song Empire dynasty, or later like the Tang Dynasty, etc. But first, this section is going to specifically focus on the Song Dynasty. So the first thing you have to know about the Song Dynasty is that they had a bureaucracy, and by that I mean that they had an imperial bureaucracy, which is an organization in which appointed officials carries out the empire's policies. So rather than the emperor of this time, who was ruling just doing every single thing, would be based on people employed below him who are members of the government, so government officials who would be carrying out the actions instead. And the way that China or the Song Dynasty chose people in their bureaucracy is through something called a civil service exam under the value of meritocracy. That basically is an exam based on ability. So how qualified are you to become a bureaucrat? It was kind of the metric they used. And the civil service exam was based largely on Confucianist texts because China, or at this period, was largely Confucianist and even is today. So here, as you can see, they used a Confucianist like texts were tested on the bureaucracy civil service exam. And some developments to know within China is like the Grand Canal, which is a waterway transportation system that really aided in trade within the country. And some like important achievements they had. I think the most important one you have to remember is jumper rice. And it wasn't necessarily from like made in China; it was actually from Vietnam, or in this case, but it was something that was a really important food staple for the Chinese people at this time. So it's really definitely important to know. They also had a lot of manufacturing and trade. And when people say, or China calls them the Middle Kingdom at this period, it was really, truly not a lie, but simply is really what it really looked like. So there were things like proto-industrialization, which is an economic policies where you make more than you simply need. And they also had artisans who made really like valuable trading goods out of like porcelain and silk, which made China one of the most powerful economic like countries, or I guess empires at this time. And another way that China or like the Song Empire got a really lot of their power was from a tributary system. So they held other countries within like their like power. Like for example, Vietnam, Japan, and Korea are some examples of countries that were tributes to China. And basically, countries that are tributary states to the Song Empire would have to pay things like money or pay things like certain goods, like goods they found, like I don't know, rice, for example, to their China, and that is a way that the Song Empire got a lot of their wealth from. And next, there's social structures in China. So China's class structure was first. The main thing you have to know is that there was a new kind of like class that was built in this time called the scholar gentry, and by this, it's people who actually like got their wealth from just really looking into Confucianist texts, and they actually become the most influential social class in China, despite other classes like simply existing already. So that's just a new kind class that was created due to the bureaucracy and the importance in Confucianist texts. Something you have to know about women is that they were forced to have foot binding, and foot binding is literally like binding your foot. If you search up the internet, you'll kind of see an example of what this looks like. But basically, the foot binding represents that women are wealthy because if you have foot binding, it's really hard to walk around because it's painful. That means that women didn't really have to do much because they were so wealthy. It's kind of the symbolic meaning behind the foot binding. The next is on paper and just printing systems. So basically, they were the first kind of country or like culture to use wood block painting, And this painting was kind of, as you can see here, it was a way to make copies of texts and art in the time, and it obviously served as a valuable resource for the Song Empire. And China was predominantly Confucian, but they still had other like influences in terms of religion. So some things you have to know is that there were many types of Buddhism. First, Theravada Buddhism, which really emphasizes personal spiritual growth. There's also Mahayana Buddhism, which looks at spiritual growth and as well, but it's slightly different. And the last thing is Tibetan Buddhism, which is basically focused on chanting. And as you can see in the name, it was the most influential in Tibet. And then there were also synchronized religions. By that I mean that two religions mixed up to create like a different type of religion. Some examples include Chan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, which got great dominance in China. And the most important thing you have to know about these Confucianist ideals is that there's something called filial piety, which means that family members have to subordinate their desires to those who are the male of the family and to the rulers. So there's just basically a line of authority that all people have to obey to, such that I guess the leader is first, and maybe the men of your household, etc. And Neo Confucianism was a syncretized thought of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, which gained a lot of popularity within China, especially later on. So looking at just three other Asian countries, in terms of Japan, Japan had during the Han period, they had like a lot of Chinese traditions that were within their country, and they also had a feudalist system. You'll probably learn more about feudalism in European culture, but basically it was similar. But the difference was that there was obviously no central government. But the first thing to note is that they had a different class. So like people like the daimyo were the people who were nobles and had the most authority, and there were samurai who were like I guess the European version of knights, and the class were slightly different, but it was still the same idea of feudalism as you would see in like European society. Next is Korea. So Korea also had a lot of similarities to China, especially because they were so geographically like proximate to the country. But they also had one difference, which is the powerful aristocracy, and that is to say that in Korea, like aristocracy had more power than in China. So that was one difference between the two countries. For in terms of Vietnam, Vietnam had, unlike like the extended families that China, Korea, or Japan had, they prefer nuclear families, and that just means that you have a wife, husband, and their children, and that is it. So that was the main difference. And although Vietnam didn't really get the bureaucracy that from China, they had another like system for scholar officials, and they also had something called polygamy. So that means that like husbands or men have more than one wife at a time. That's really it for like the first section. This is the MCQ. You feel free to do it on your own time, and it would really help. So I like for your AP exam preps, I would suggest you do this. So next is 1.2 and developments in Dar al-Islam, or the world of Islam. So first, as you guys probably know, after Muhammad's death, so basically that's the messenger of Allah in the Islam world, there was a lot of Islam spread a lot, especially in like the Middle Eastern areas of the world. And one really important center of learning is one of the House of Wisdom, which is in Baghdad. I think that would be current day Iraq. I'm not quite sure exactly where it was placed in this time, but yes. So first, let's look at some trade routes. So let's first look at the Egyptian Mamluks. And Arabs often actually purchase enslaved people or Mamluks, for frequently like ethnic terms from Central Asia. In Egypt, the Mamluks actually seized control of the government, and they made something called the Mamluk Sultanate. And they obviously prospered from trade between Islamic and the European world, but eventually they do lose power as the Portuguese opted into sea exploration, which you'll learn about in Unit 4. And there's also the Seljuk Turks, and the Seljuk Turks were also Muslims. And like many Muslim societies, the leader of the Seljuk Turks were known as the Sultan. And next, you'll look into Crusaders. Honestly, they're not really the most important part in terms of Islam. But one thing you do have to know is that Crusaders tried to actually conquer Islamic lands to gain access to trade routes. So that's one thing you have to know about the empires. And next is the Mongols. You'll learn more about them in Unit 2 about Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and the many Khans from the Mongols. But the Mongols actually attacked the Abbasid Empire and eventually led to the fall of many of the Islamic empires that we'll talk about in this section. Once again, Baghdad is a very important trading route where people got not only trade but also wisdom from what was just offered there as a whole. And looking at first, the Abbasid Caliphate was led by Arabs and Persians. But later, it was actually shaped more by Turkic people who descended from Central Asia. And here are some important cultural innovations. You should probably know these names. It might not come on the AP exam, but it is something that a lot of teachers emphasize. So the first person is Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, and he's someone who made a lot of contributions to actually a lot of fields, but the most important thing you have to know about is trigonometry and the astronomic parts. And the next person is the Sufi poet and Aisha al-Bayunida, and she's known for being the first woman Muslim writer in this century. And here we learn about Sufis, and Sufis are kind of not necessarily Sunni or Shia, but they're kind of a mix, and they actually emphasize the introspection to grasp truth that they could not be understood just simply through learning. Something you have to know about is women in Islam. Although ironically, when you think of Middle Eastern women in the contemporary time, they like lack rights, etc. In this period, actually, women had quite a bit of status, like especially people who are like the wives of sultans, or at the very least, like are a high authority. They actually had a higher status than like Christian or Jewish women at the time. So they were able to maybe inherit property, or they could remarry if they were widowed, and they could even initiate divorce under specific conditions. So you have to know that women in this period in Islam had quite a bit of authority, unlike contrary to like contemporary beliefs. And there's also something called concubines, which is not necessarily the wives of sultans, but basically women just engage in activities with their like sultan illegally, but that is actually a way a lot of Islamic leaders that had many sons slash daughters. That is important thing to know. And one thing you have to know is that Islamic rule not only just was parochial in the sense that it wasn't limited to the Middle East or the Arab region, but they got power in the Spanish, specifically Eastern Anatolia, and they were also able to get a lot of influence in Islam and get a lot of power in that area of Spain as well. So they even went to Europe, although eventually the Spanish reconquered this area. During the Battle of Tours, they do successfully expand all the way to Spain and keep quite a bit of power there. So that is one thing you should notice. So that is it for today. And next we'll look into development South and Southeast Asia while you learn about Indian empires and empires in Indonesia, modern day, and also in Cambodia. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.